That is not your heart. That is the sound of distant artillery, echoing across the dark canopy of the Solomon Islands. The cicadas scream in waves, thousands of them, making the jungle itself seem alive with electric madness. Rain hammers down in sheets so thick you can't see 5 feet ahead, turning the red earth into a sucking swamp that pulls at your boots with every step. And somewhere, out there in the black void between the trees, something waits. This wasn't a tropical paradise. This was the green hell, a place where the living envied the dead, where dysentery hollowed you out from the inside, where malaria turned your blood to fire, where your own shadow could kill you if you looked at it wrong. They say the island breathes, but on Guadalcanal in 1942, it didn't just breathe, it held its breath, waiting to swallow 30,000 souls whole. Welcome back to Ghost Stories of the Battles. I am your host, and tonight, we are deploying to the Pacific Theater. The 7th of August, 1942, Operation Watchtower, the first major Allied offensive against the Empire of Japan. The United States Marine Corps hit the beaches of Guadalcanal, and what they thought would be a quick seizure of a half-built airstrip turned into 6 months of relentless, grinding hell. This wasn't the clean warfare of the European theater. This was primal. Fanatical charges at midnight. Soldiers starving in the jungle, reduced to skin, wrapped skeletons. The smell, God, the smell, of rot and cordite and unwashed men baking in 100-degree heat. The prize was Henderson Field, a muddy airstrip hacked out of the jungle. Control the airfield. And you could strike deep into Japanese, held territory. Lose it and the entire Pacific campaign collapses. So they fought for it, hand to hand, night after night. In the dense rainforest, where visibility was measured in arm's lengths, where you heard the enemy before you saw them, where death came as a whisper through the leaves. And the waters surrounding Guadalcanal became known as Iron Bottom Sound, the stretch of ocean with the highest density of shipwrecks in the world. Destroyers, cruisers, transports, all sent to the bottom in desperate nighttime naval battles. Sailors burning alive in oil slicks, ships torn apart by torpedoes. The ocean itself became a graveyard. When the sun went down over the Solomon Islands, the war didn't stop, it just changed. The enemy became invisible, and the mind became the battlefield. Our first story takes us to the mud, slicked slopes of a place they called Bloody Ridge. Story 1. The echoes of Bloody Ridge. Private James Miller was 19 years old and had been on Guadalcanal for exactly 48 hours when they shoved him into a foxhole on Edson's Ridge. He'd lied about his age to get into the Corps. Back in Nebraska, he'd imagined glory, charging beaches, raising flags, coming home a hero. The recruiter had smiled and shaken his hand, and Miller had grinned like an idiot, thinking he'd won some kind of prize. That felt like a different lifetime now, a different person entirely. The ridge was a hellscape. Even in daylight, you could see the carnage from the previous night's banzai charge. Bodies in the wire, dozens of them, twisted and bloating in the equatorial heat. Some still had their hands raised, frozen mid. Charge fingers clawed like they were trying to tear the sky open. The smell was indescribable. Sweet and rotten, like overripe fruit left in the sun, mixed with the acrid stench of burnt flesh and cordite. Don't look at them too long, kid. Miller flinched. He hadn't even heard the man approach. Sergeant Hayes materialized beside him like smoke, his face gaunt and expressionless. Hayes had the 1,000-yard stare, eyes that looked through you, into some middle distance where the normal rules of sanity no longer applied. The sergeant carried his rifle with the casual ease of a man who'd forgotten what it felt like to be unarmed. "Sergeant," Miller managed, trying to sound professional. His voice cracked. Hayes didn't acknowledge the greeting. He just stared out at the wire, at the bodies tangled in it like obscene decorations. "You are with me tonight. You stay alert. You stay quiet. And you remember one thing, Private. "What is that, Sergeant?" Hayes finally looked at him, and Miller felt his blood turn to ice water. The sergeant's eyes weren't quite right, like looking into the eyes of a man who drowned but kept on living anyway. "Don't shoot at the shadows," Hayes said softly, "or the shadows shoot back." Miller wanted to ask what that meant, but Hayes had already turned away, settling into the foxhole with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd done this 100 times. Miller climbed in after him, the mud squelching beneath his boots. The hole was deeper than he'd expected, the walls shored up with ammunition crates and sandbags. It smelled like earth and old sweat and fear. Night came fast in the jungle. One moment the sky was bruised purple, and the next it was pitch black, absolute and suffocating. The cicadas reached a fever pitch, their screaming so loud it felt like pressure behind Miller's eyes. He gripped his M1 Garand tight enough to make his knuckles ache, scanning the tree line for movement. "How many nights you been up here, Sergeant?" Miller whispered. "7. "They hit you every night." Hayes was silent for a long moment. "Yeah," he finally said. "They hit us every night." An hour passed, then 2. Miller's eyes began playing tricks on him, shapes moving in the darkness that disappeared when he focused on them. The jungle was alive with sounds, the rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs, the distant boom of artillery. Every noise made his heart spike, and then he heard it. Weeping soft at first, barely audible over the cicadas, a low, keening wail that rose and fell like wind through a cracked window. It was coming from the jungle, from the direction of the wire. Miller's breath caught in his throat. "Sergeant," he hissed. "You hear that?" Hayes didn't move. He sat perfectly still, his rifle resting across his knees, staring out into the darkness. "Yeah, what is it?" "Don't know, don't matter." But it did matter, because the weeping was getting louder, and now Miller could make out distinct voices, multiple voices, all crying in unison. It sounded like mourning, like grief, so profound it had taken physical form and crawled out of the earth. The hair on the back of Miller's neck stood up, movement in the wire. Miller's eyes locked onto it, his finger tightening on the trigger. One of the bodies was moving. No, not moving, rising. Standing up in the tangle of barbed wire slowly, jerkily, like a puppet being yanked upright by invisible strings. It stood there, swaying slightly, its head hanging at an unnatural angle. Then another one stood, and another all along the wire. The corpses were pulling themselves to their feet, standing in the darkness like a grotesque honor guard. They didn't charge, they didn't move forward. They just stood there, silent now, all facing the ridge. "Jesus Christ," Miller breathed. "Sergeant, you seeing this?" "I am seeing it." "What do we do?" "Nothing, we do nothing." One of the figures raised its arm slowly. Deliberately, it pointed directly at Miller. Then the others did the same, all of them pointing at the foxholes on the ridge. Their arms extended like accusations. Miller could see their faces now in the faint starlight, mouths hanging open, eyes gone, skin blackened and peeling, but they were looking at him. He knew they were looking at him. "Sergeant," there, the sound that erupted from the jungle cut Miller off mid-sentence. It was a scream, no, 1,000 screams, all blending together into one unholy roar, the Banzai cry. Banzaiea! It split the night like a blade, and suddenly the figures in the wire weren't standing still anymore. They were running. Miller opened fire without thinking. The M1 kicked against his shoulder, muzzle flash lighting up the darkness in strobing bursts. He could see them now, dozens of them, hundreds maybe, pouring out of the jungle and through the wire. Their faces were twisted in rage and agony, their mouths open in that endless scream. He fired and fired and fired, ejecting the empty clip with shaking hands and slamming in another. But Hayes wasn't firing. Miller realized this with a jolt of terror. The sergeant sat perfectly still, his rifle across his lap. staring out at the charging horde with that same empty expression. "Sergeant," Miller screamed. "Shoot, for God's sake, shoot." Hayes didn't move. The attackers were close now, so close Miller could see the details of their uniforms, the gleam of their bayonets. He emptied another clip into them, saw bodies jerk and fall, but more kept coming. They were going to overrun the position. They were going to kill him. He fumbled for another clip, his hands slick with sweat, breath coming in ragged gasps. And then the flare went up. Some unknown down the line had fired an illumination round, and it burst overhead in a bloom of brilliant white light. The entire ridge was bathed in harsh, shadowless radiance. Miller looked out at the wire, ready to see the enemy right on top of him. The wire was empty. No charging soldiers, no screaming faces. Just the same corpses from before, lying tangled in the barbed wire exactly as they had been all day, unmoving, silent. The jungle was quiet. Even the cicadas had stopped. Miller stared, his mind trying to process what he was seeing or not seeing. "But I saw them. They were right there. I shot." "Yeah," Hayes said quietly. "You shot them. But they're not. There is no fresh bodies. There is nothing." Hayes finally turned to look at him in the flare light. The sergeant's face looked ancient, worn down to the bone. "Those men died 3 nights ago, private. They come back every night to try and take the hill again. Same charge, same screams, same everything. That is not possible." Hayes's laugh was dry and bitter. "Number it is not. But it happens anyway every night, right on schedule." He paused, then added, "The gunfire you heard, that was all in your head, son. Or maybe it is echoing from someplace else, someplace that ain't quite here anymore." Miller looked down at his rifle. The barrel was hot from firing. He'd gone through 4 clips, 32 rounds. But when he looked out at the wire, there wasn't a single fresh bullet hole. The mud around the foxhole was undisturbed. No brass casings littered the ground beside him. "I don't understand," he whispered. "Neither do I, kid, but I'll tell you what I do know. This ridge is a recording. It plays the same death over and over again, and we're stuck here watching it. Those boys out there in the wire, they don't know they're dead. They're still fighting, still trying to take Henderson Field. And they're gonna keep trying until whatever force is keeping them here finally lets go." The flare died, plunging them back into darkness. Miller sat in the foxhole, trembling, his rifle clutched to his chest. He could still hear the echo of that banzai scream in his head, could still see those pointing fingers, those accusing, eyeless faces. How do you deal with it?" he asked. Hayes was quiet for a long time. "You don't," he finally said. "You just learn to live with it, or you go crazy. Most guys go crazy." Dawn came slowly, bleeding red across the eastern sky. Miller sat in the foxhole, physically unharmed but feeling like something fundamental inside him had shattered. He understood now what the sergeant had meant about the 1,000-yard stare. It wasn't about looking far away. It was about looking at something you couldn't quite reach, a version of reality that existed parallel to this one, where the dead kept fighting and the war never ended. The bodies in the wire hadn't moved. They lay there in the morning light, already bloating further in the heat. But Miller knew that when night fell again, they would rise, they would point, they would charge. And the recording would play again, a tape of death that never stopped spinning. By the time they were relieved at 0800, Miller had aged a decade. He climbed out of the foxhole on shaking legs, following Hayes down the reverse slope of the ridge. He never looked back. He didn't need to. He knew the ridge would still be there tonight, and the night after, playing its terrible symphony for whoever was unlucky enough to be in the orchestra. Some places, Miller realized, don't let their dead rest. Some places hold on to their violence like a grudge, replaying it endlessly until the land itself becomes haunted. Bloody Ridge was one of those places, and it would keep playing its song long after the last Marine left Guadalcanal. The Marines on Guadalcanal had a saying, "The jungle wanted to kill you, but the ocean wanted to swallow you whole." They were trapped on that island not just by the enemy, but by the water itself. The Navy had lost control of the seas around Guadalcanal in those early months. Japanese destroyers ran the gauntlet every night. The infamous Tokyo Express, bringing reinforcements and supplies while American ships tried desperately to stop them. The battles were brutal, fought at point blank range in pitch darkness. Ships would pass so close, you could hear the enemy sailors shouting to each other. The waters became a graveyard. Cruisers, destroyers, submarines, all sent to the bottom in fiery, screaming death. Oil slicks burned for miles. Men drowned trapped in overturned compartments, pounding on the steel hull as the water rose. The stretch of ocean between Guadalcanal, Savo Island, and Florida Island earned a new name, Iron Bottom Sound. To this day, it remains the area with the highest density of shipwrecks in the world. And on quiet nights, sailors still report seeing things in those waters. Things that shouldn't be there. Our second story takes us into the graveyard shift, where the dead watch from below, Story 2. The dead watch on Iron Bottom Sound signalman, First Class Patrick O'Reilly, stood on the bridge wing of the USS Fletcher, binoculars pressed to his eyes, scanning the black water for movement. It was 2300 hours, the graveyard shift, the witching hour, the time when the Tokyo Express typically made its run. The water was unnaturally calm, slick with oil from a tanker that had gone down 2 weeks prior. The oil caught the faint starlight and turned the ocean into a dark mirror, reflecting nothing but emptiness. O'Reilly had been in the Navy for 3 years, but he'd seen more death in the last 2 months than in his entire life before. He'd watched the USS Juno take a torpedo amidships and break in half, sinking in 42 seconds. He'd pulled burned men from the water, their skin sloughing off in his hands. He'd helped fish out corpses bloated beyond recognition, their tags the only thing identifying them as human beings. The crew talked in hushed tones during night watch. Nobody liked being on the Sound after dark. Too many ghosts down there, they said, too many boys who never made it home. O'Reilly tried not to believe in that sort of thing. He was from Boston, a practical man, the son of a longshoreman who'd taught him that the only things to fear were the things you could see and touch. But Iron Bottom Sound had a way of making believers out of skeptics. Contact, came a voice from the radar room. Debris field bearing 090, distance 300 yards. The Fletcher altered course slightly, engines throttled down to a crawl. They passed debris fields all the time out here, planking from shattered ships, life jackets, fuel drums, sometimes bodies. The protocol was to note it in the log and keep moving. They couldn't stop for every piece of wreckage, not when the Tokyo Express might appear at any moment. O'Reilly swung his binoculars toward the debris field. At first, he saw what he expected, dark shapes floating on the oily water, rising and falling gently with the swell. But then the shapes moved, not with the motion of the waves, but against them, purposefully. He adjusted the focus. His breath caught. They were hands, dozens of them, hundreds maybe, reaching up from the black water, pale fingers breaking the surface, grasping at nothing, clawing toward the sky. Some were missing fingers, others were skeletal, the flesh rotted away. But they all reached upward with the same desperate yearning, like drowning men making one final grab for salvation. "Jesus," O'Reilly whispered. He pulled the binoculars away, rubbed his eyes, looked again. The hands were still there, a forest of them waving slowly back and forth like kelp in a current. O'Reilly, the officer of the deck, called. What do you see? He should report it. He should tell them what he was seeing. But something stopped him. The certainty that if he said the words out loud, if he made it real, something terrible would happen. "Just debris, sir," he heard himself say. "Nothing significant." As the Fletcher passed through the field, O'Reilly watched the hands track their movement. They turned, following the ship, fingers flexing. He could see arms now extending up from the water, impossibly long. Like the ocean itself was sprouting limbs, no bodies, no heads, just arms reaching, always reaching. And then they were past it, leaving the hands behind in their wake. O'Reilly exhaled shackily. Lowering the binoculars, his hands were trembling. Radar contact, the radar room called out. Urgency in the operator's voice. Large vessel, bearing 270. Range 4,000 yards and closing. Battle stations, the captain ordered, his voice calm but clipped. The alarm sounded, a harsh, urgent clanging that sent men running to their posts. O'Reilly felt his heart hammering. This was it. The Tokyo Express had arrived, but something was wrong. The radar operator's voice came back, confused now. Sir, the contact. It is not maneuvering. It is not changing course or speed. It is just coming straight at us. Classification. The captain demanded. Unknown, sir. The return is. It is wrong. Too big for a destroyer, wrong profile for a cruiser. It is like nothing I've seen before. O'Reilly raised his binoculars, scanning the direction of the contact. At first, he saw nothing but darkness and the faint line of the horizon. Then the fog rolled in. It came from nowhere, a wall of gray. White mist that seemed to materialize out of the ocean itself. It moved against the wind, flowing toward them like something alive. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in seconds. O'Reilly's breath began to steam in the suddenly frigid air. And through the fog, something emerged. A ship. O'Reilly's blood turned to ice. It was a cruiser. He could tell by the profile, the heavy gun turrets, the tall superstructure. But it was glowing, a sickly, bioluminescent green light emanated from every surface, like St. Elmo's fire gone horribly wrong. The glow pulsed slowly, rhythmically, like a heartbeat. Sir, O'Reilly called out, his voice cracking. Visual contact, unknown cruiser, bearing 270. The captain grabbed his own binoculars, looked, went perfectly still. Mother of God, he breathed. The ghost ship drew closer, moving with impossible silence. There was no engine noise, no bow wave, no wake. It simply glided across the water like an apparition. The green light casting eerie shadows across the fog. O'Reilly could see details now. The twisted, melted metal of the superstructure, the guns frozen in position, the gaping holes in the hull that should have sent it to the bottom. And the crew, oh God, the crew. They were on deck, dozens of them, moving through the motions of damage control, running with hoses that weren't connected to anything, fighting fires that weren't there. Their uniforms were charred and tattered, their exposed skin blackened and peeling. Some were missing limbs. Others had faces that were little more than skulls with scraps of flesh clinging to the bone. But they kept working, kept running, kept fighting a battle that had ended months ago. It is the Astoria. Someone whispered behind O'Reilly. Jesus Christ, it is the Astoria. The USS Astoria had gone down in August, during the Battle of Savo Island, hit by torpedoes and shellfire. She'd burned for hours before finally sinking. O'Reilly had heard the stories, how the crew had fought to save her right up until the moment she went under, refusing to abandon ship even when it was clearly hopeless. The Phantom cruiser passed alongside the Fletcher, close enough that O'Reilly could have thrown a baseball and hit it. He could see the sailors now in terrible detail. One man was beating at flames on his chest that weren't there, his mouth open in a silent scream. Another was manning a gun mount, loading shells in an endless loop, ejecting them, loading again. A third was dragging a body across the deck, except there was no body in his arms. His hands gripped nothing but air, and then O'Reilly made the mistake of making eye contact with one of them. The sailor was standing at the rail, looking directly at the Fletcher. His eyes were hollow sockets, burned away by fire, but O'Reilly felt the weight of that eyeless gaze like a physical pressure. The sailor raised one charred hand, and pointed at him. At O'Reilly specifically, the mouth moved, forming words that made no sound. "You are next." O'Reilly couldn't look away. He was frozen, locked in that terrible, impossible stare. The sailor's mouth kept moving, repeating the same words over and over. "You are next. You are next. You are next." And then sound came, not from the ghost ship, from all around it. The shriek of bending metal, the roar of explosions, the screaming of men burning alive. It was deafening, overwhelming, the collected agony of an entire ship's death compressed into a single sustained howl. O'Reilly clapped his hands over his ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't coming through his ears. It was inside his head, boring into his skull. The phantom ship glided past, disappearing into the fog as silently as it had arrived. The sound cut off abruptly, leaving only the normal sounds of the ocean and the Fletcher's engines. The water was undisturbed. There was no wake, no debris, no evidence that anything had been there at all. Did everyone the captain started then stopped? He didn't need to finish the question. Every man on the bridge had seen it. Their faces were pale, eyes wide with shock. "Radar contact," the operator called out, his voice high and tight. "Multiple contacts, bearing 090, range 3,000 yards. Destroyers, sir. It is the Tokyo Express." This time the contacts were real. Japanese destroyers, 4 of them, running the gauntlet to resupply their forces on Guadalcanal. The Fletcher went to action immediately, the crew shaking off their shock and falling into well-drilled routines, guns trained around, torpedoes armed. The other American ships in the area were converging, preparing for the engagement. But as O'Reilly manned his station, he couldn't shake the feeling that the Astoria, or whatever that thing had been, hadn't been a random haunting. It had been a warning, a premonition. The dead were watching from below, and they knew what was coming. The battle that followed was brutal. The Fletcher took a shell hit to the aft deck, killing 3 men instantly. Fire broke out in the engine room. For 20 terrifying minutes, it looked like they might follow the Astoria to the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound. But the damage control parties got the fires under control, and the Fletcher limped away as the Japanese withdrew. O'Reilly survived, but he was never the same. Every time he looked at the ocean after that night, he saw hands reaching up from the depths. Every ship's silhouette in the distance made his heart race, waiting for that sickly green glow to appear. He knew now what waited below the surface of Iron Bottom Sound. The sailors down there were lonely. They were still fighting their battles, still trying to save ships that couldn't be saved, and they were waiting for company. Always waiting. The ocean was crowded with ghosts, and sooner or later, every sailor who passed through those waters would join them. O'Reilly requested a transfer as soon as the Fletcher made port. He never sailed on Iron Bottom Sound again, but on quiet nights even thousands of miles away, he could still hear that terrible sound. The death scream of a ship and her crew echoing across time and water, a warning that the ocean never forgets and the dead never truly rest. While the Marines held the perimeter around Henderson Field and the Navy fought for control of the waters, another nightmare was unfolding deep in the jungle interior. The Japanese soldiers trapped on Guadalcanal were dying, not from bullets, but from starvation. Supply lines were cut. The Tokyo Express couldn't get enough food through. Men began wasting away, their bodies consuming themselves from the inside out. They called it Ga-to-jima, Starvation Island. By November 1942, Japanese soldiers were reduced to eating grass, tree bark, and leather from their boots. Some resorted to darker measures, and in the depths of that suffering, something else took root in the jungle, something that fed on hunger itself. Our third story takes us to the Guadalcanal River, where a Marine Raider scout team discovered that some hungers can never be satisfied, even by death. Story 3. The hunger of the Guadalcanal Sergeant Marcus Vance had been a hunter before the war. back in Montana. He'd tracked elk through mountain passes and grizzly bears through dense forest. He knew how to read signs, how to move silently, how to sense when he was being watched. Those skills had made him valuable to the Marine Raiders, the elite scout, sniper unit tasked with deep penetration missions behind enemy lines. Now, in October 1942, Sergeant Vance and his 5-man team were 10 miles west of Henderson Field, deep in Japanese, held territory along the Matanikaw River, trying to assess enemy strength for an upcoming offensive. The jungle here was different from the areas around the airfield, darker, older. The trees grew so thick that even at midday, the forest floor existed in perpetual twilight. Everything was rotting, fallen logs, dead leaves, the very air itself thick with decay. The smell was overpowering, sweet and putrid, like a slaughterhouse left in the sun. "Christ, Sarge," whispered Corporal Davis, swatting at the cloud of flies that swarmed around them. "What the hell is that stench?" "Bodies," Vance replied quietly. "Lots of them. The Japs have been taking heavy casualties out here. No way to bury them all in this heat." They'd been seeing signs of the enemy for hours, freshly cut trails, abandoned equipment, foxholes. But no actual soldiers. It was like the Japanese had simply vanished into the jungle. That bothered Vance. In his experience, when the prey disappeared, it usually meant you'd become the hunted. They found the first encampment an hour before sunset. It was a small bivouac area, maybe a squad-sized position, tucked into a natural depression in the terrain. But something was wrong. The camp was abandoned, but not in the usual way. The ponchos were still strung up between trees. Packs lay open on the ground, contents spilled out. Most disturbing of all, there were bowls of rice, actual rice, precious as gold out here, sitting uneaten, already beginning to mold. "They left their food," Private Chen said, his voice tight. "Nobody leaves their food, not out here. Not when everyone's starving." Vance knelt beside one of the bowls. The rice was covered in a thin layer of mold, but underneath it was relatively fresh. A day old, maybe 2. He looked around the camp, his hunter's instincts screaming warnings. The men hadn't left in an organized withdrawal. There were no signs of combat, no blood, no brass casings. They'd just run. Dropped everything and run. Sarge Davis called from the edge of the camp, "You need to see this." Vance moved to where Davis was standing, looking at the base of a massive banyan tree. Someone had carved symbols into the bark, Japanese characters, crude and desperate. Looking, the cuts deep and ragged like they'd been made with a bayonet. Beside the characters was a simple drawing, a mouth, open wide, filled with sharp teeth. "Can anyone read this?" Vance asked. Private Tanaka, their Nisei translator, stepped forward. He studied the characters for a long moment, his face growing pale. "It says the hunger is not ours. It has teeth. Do not sleep. Do not dream. It eats from the inside." A chill ran down Vance's spine despite the oppressive heat. "What does that mean?" Tanaka shook his head slowly. "I don't know, Sarge, but there is another word here, Gaki. It is from Japanese folklore. It means hungry ghost." "Ghost stories," Davis muttered. "Great. Just what we need." But Vance wasn't so sure. He'd hunted enough to know that fear could make men hallucinate, could make them see threats that weren't there, but it could also sharpen their senses, make them aware of genuine danger before it struck. And whatever had scared these Japanese soldiers had scared them badly enough to abandon food in the middle of a famine. "We keep moving," he decided. "Find those caves intelligence mentioned. Get our intel and get out. I want to be back inside our lines before dark." But they didn't make it back before dark. The jungle had other plans. They found the cave system just as twilight was fading to full darkness. It was a natural formation, carved out of limestone by centuries of water flow. The entrance was partially hidden by vines and undergrowth, but someone had been using it. There were footprints in the mud. supply crates stacked inside the mouth of the cave. Vance signaled for a halt, listening. The jungle around them had gone quiet. No birds, no insects, just an oppressive, waiting silence that made the hair on his neck stand up. "Chen Davis, you are with me," he whispered. "Tanaka, Wilson, Kowalski, perimeter security. Anything moves, you light it up." They moved into the cave, flashlights cutting narrow beams through the darkness. The interior was larger than expected, opening up into a natural chamber, maybe 30 feet across. More supply crates, stacked and organized. A field desk with papers scattered across it, and journals. Dozens of journals lying open like someone had been reading them all at once. Vance picked one up, flipping through the pages. The handwriting was cramped and desperate, the kanji characters growing more erratic with each page. He couldn't read Japanese, but he didn't need to. The sketches told the story well enough, emaciated figures. Men reduced to walking skeletons, their ribs visible through taut skin. Mouths opened impossibly wide, and everywhere that same symbol from the tree, the mouth filled with teeth, Tanaka. Vance called out quietly, "Get in here." The translator entered the cave, took the journal, began reading. His face went from pale to ashen. "Jesus," he breathed. "Sarge, this is insane. They're writing about the hunger. Not just being hungry, the hunger, like it is a separate thing, an entity. What do you mean, an entity?" Tanaka flipped through pages, translating haltingly. October 3rd. Watanabe disappeared last night. We found his pack, his weapon. He was on watch. No signs of struggle. October 5th. The dreams are getting worse. I dream I am eating, but I wake up and my mouth is full of dirt. October 7th. I saw them in the jungle. The gaki, they move wrong, too fast. Their bellies are swollen, but their limbs are like sticks. They click when they walk. Jesus Christ. Keep reading. October 9th. We are not fighting Americans anymore. We are fighting the gaki. They were our men once. I recognize faces, but starvation has changed them into something else. They cannot die because they are already dead. Bullets pass through them. They don't bleed. They just keep coming. And when they catch you, it stops there. The page is torn. A sound from outside the cave, clicking, like someone snapping dry sticks together. Vance's head snapped up, everyone out. Now, back-to-back formation. They emerged from the cave into full darkness. The team had already formed a defensive circle, rifles pointed outward. Wilson's voice was tight with fear. "Sarge, we got movement all around us. Can't get a clear visual." Vance swept his flashlight across the tree line. For a moment he saw nothing. Then the beam caught something, a figure standing between two trees. His finger tightened on the trigger, then relaxed in shock. It was a Japanese soldier, or it had been. The man was skeletal, skin pulled so tight across his bones that he looked like a corpse that had been dug up and propped upright. His uniform hung on him like a shroud. His eyes were sunken deep in their sockets, glittering with a terrible, mindless hunger, and his belly was grotesquely distended, swollen like he'd swallowed a basketball, making his stick, thin limbs look even more obscene by comparison. The figure took a step forward, his legs bent wrong, knees hyperextending, feet splaying out at impossible angles, and he made that clicking sound coming from his throat, from his chest, a rapid tick, tick, tick like an insect's call. "Hold fire," Vance ordered, though every instinct screamed at him to shoot. It might be a survivor, might be starving, delirious. Then another figure stepped out of the darkness, and another. They came from all sides, surrounding the team. All of them with that same skeletal, yet bloated appearance, all making that horrible clicking sound. Tanaka whispered, his voice breaking. "There, gaki." One of the figures lunged. Not walked, lunged. Covering the distance between trees in a single impossible bound, Davis fired. 3 quick shots center mass. The figure jerked with each impact but didn't slow. It crashed into Davis, bearing him to the ground. The clicking intensified, became a chittering frenzy. Vance roared. The jungle erupted with muzzle flashes. Vance emptied his magazine into the creature on top of Davis, saw chunks of flesh blown away, saw bones shatter, but it kept moving, kept clicking, kept clawing. There was no blood. The wounds didn't bleed. It was like shooting a scarecrow. Chen waded in with his Ka-Bar knife, stabbing the thing in the neck. It turned its head, that eyeless, sunken, socket gaze fixing on him. Its mouth opened, too wide, wider than any human mouth should open, the jaw unhinging like a snake's, and inside teeth. Rows and rows of teeth, spiraling down into darkness. It bit Chen's arm, he screamed, a sound that cut through the chaos of gunfire. When the thing pulled back, it took a chunk of Chen's forearm with it. Not cutting, tearing, ripping the flesh away with brute force. More of them poured out of the jungle, fast, too fast, moving with that horrible, wrong, jointed gait, their bloated bellies swinging obscenely. Wilson went down, 3 of them on him at once. His screams lasted maybe 10 seconds. "The cave," Vance shouted. "Fall back to the cave." They ran Davis, bleeding from a dozen scratches. Chen clutching his mangled arm, Tanaka and Kowalski firing behind them as they retreated. Vance grabbed a thermite grenade from his belt, pulled the pin, hurled it at the cave entrance. The creatures were right behind them. Vance could hear their clicking, could smell them. A reek of rot and starvation and something else, something ancient and wrong. They piled into the cave after the Marines. The thermite caught. White, hot fire filled the cave entrance, the magnesium burning at 3,000 degrees. Vance heard the creatures shriek, the first sound they'd made beyond that clicking, high-pitched, agonized wails that barely sounded human. Then came the deeper rumble of stone cracking, the thermite heat causing the limestone to fracture and collapse. Vance triggered his last grenade, a high explosive this time, and threw it into the inferno. The explosion brought down the cave mouth completely, tons of rock sealing them in, number not sealing them in, sealing the things out. In the sudden darkness, Vance could hear his team breathing, ragged and panicked. Flashlights came on, revealing their faces, pale, shocked, splattered with blood. "There is another way out," Tanaka said, his voice shaking. "Has to be caves like this. They always have another entrance." They found it, a narrow passage at the back of the cave, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. They crawled through on their bellies, flashlights clenched in their teeth, dragging their weapons behind them. The passage seemed to go on forever, the walls pressing in from all sides. Behind them, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of clicking. The creatures were in the cave. Digging through the rubble, Vance crawled faster, ignoring the rock scraping his elbows and knees raw. The clicking grew louder, closer. How were they getting through? The entrance was blocked by tons of stone. Unless they were digging, tearing through the rock with their bare hands, driven by that mindless eternal hunger. Light ahead, natural light. The passage opened up into another chamber, and beyond that, blessed beautiful starlight, an exit. They burst out of the cave, gasping, covered in blood and limestone dust. Vance turned back to the entrance, grabbed another grenade. His last one. He pulled the pin, let the spoon fly, and threw it as far back into the passage as he could. Run, the explosion shook the ground, brought down the passage in a cascade of rock and debris. They kept running, didn't stop until they were a mile away. Back in the deeper jungle, where the trees grew thick and the darkness felt almost safe by comparison. They made it back to American lines just before dawn. 3 of them, Davis and Wilson were gone, taken by those things. Chen's arm was infected, the wound already festering. He'd lose it to amputation 2 days later. Vance filed his report, enemy strength assessment, cave system location, recommendations for artillery strikes. He didn't mention the Gaki. The intelligence officer wouldn't have believed him anyway. Hell, Vance barely believed it himself in the harsh light of day. But at night, he believed. At night, he could still hear that clicking, could still see those bloated bellies and skeletal limbs, could still remember the feeling of fighting something that wasn't quite dead and wasn't quite alive, something born from starvation so profound it had taken on a life of its own. The worst part, for days afterward, none of them could eat. Everything tasted like ash, like dirt, like the inside of that cave. Their bodies were starving, but their minds rejected food. It was like they'd caught something from those creatures, a psychic infection, the hunger that wasn't hunger. Eventually, they recovered. But Vance never forgot what he'd learned in those caves, that suffering, when concentrated enough, when desperate enough, can take physical form. The Japanese soldiers trapped on Guadalcanal had starved not just in body but in spirit, and in that spiritual starvation, something had been born, something that fed not on flesh but on the act of consuming itself. The Gaki, hungry ghosts, forever trying to fill a void that could never be filled, and somewhere in the jungles of Guadalcanal, sealed in collapsed caves and hidden in the darkness between the trees, they were still there, still hungry, always hungry. By February 1943, the Japanese had evacuated their remaining forces from Guadalcanal. The island was secure. Henderson Field was firmly in American hands. The Marines began the grim work of cleaning up, collecting bodies, processing the dead, cataloging enemy equipment. It was during this mop-up phase that men learned an important lesson. In war, you don't take souvenirs. The dead don't like to be robbed. And on Guadalcanal, where the line between the living and the dead had grown thin as rice paper, taking something that didn't belong to you could mean inviting something terrible into your life. Our final story is about a man who learned this lesson the hard way. Story 4. The pale passenger corpsman David Klein was 22 years old and had seen more death in 6 months than most people see in a lifetime. As a Navy medic assigned to the Marines, he'd patched wounds under fire, held dying men as they bled out, and pronounced dead boys who looked young enough to be in high school. He'd developed a professional distance from it all. Had to, or he'd go insane. Death was just part of the job. You did what you could, and when you couldn't do anything more, you moved on to the next patient. After the Japanese evacuation, David was assigned to a burial detail and intelligence. Gathering team, they'd sweep through former enemy positions, tag bodies for burial, collect any documents or equipment that might be useful. It was grim work, but it beat getting shot at. That is how he found the bunker. It was north of Henderson Field, in an area that had been heavily shelled during the November offensive. The jungle was torn apart here, trees reduced to splintered stumps, craters big enough to swallow a jeep. The ground churned into a moonscape of mud and debris. Most of the Japanese fortifications had been pulverized, but this bunker had survived. Somehow, impossibly, it sat intact in the middle of a field of destruction. Sandbags barely disturbed, roof beams unbroken, like a bubble of normalcy in a world of chaos. David approached cautiously, rifle at the ready. Booby traps were common in abandoned positions, but there was no tripwire, no warning sign, just a dark entrance leading down into the earth. He descended the steps, flashlight cutting through the darkness. The bunker was small, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, reinforced with logs and packed earth. There was a cot in the corner, neatly made, a small desk with papers arranged in precise rows, and on the wall, mounted carefully on wooden pegs, was a sword. Not just any sword, a katana. a beautiful katana. The scabbard was lacquered black with red silk wrapping. The tsuba, the guard, was ornate, depicting a dragon coiled around cherry blossoms. David had seen captured Japanese swords before, mostly cheap mass-produced gunto issued to officers. But this was different. This was a work of art, an heirloom, worth a fortune to a collector. He looked around the bunker. No body, no sign of the officer who'd owned this. The man must have evacuated with the others, been forced to leave his sword behind. Shame. Really, David knew enough about Japanese culture to understand that a sword like this would have been in a family for generations. The officer must have been heartbroken to abandon it. David reached out and lifted the sword from its mount. It was lighter than he expected, perfectly balanced. He drew it a few inches from the scabbard. The blade gleamed in the flashlight beam. Mirror, bright, not a spot of rust or tarnish despite the jungle humidity. He should turn it in. Protocol said all captured weapons went to intelligence, but nobody knew he'd found this place. The bunker was isolated off the main sweep path. He could keep it, ship it home when he rotated out. His dad collected antiques. He'd love this. David slid the blade back into the scabbard and tucked it under his arm. As he turned to leave, his flashlight swept across the desk. There was a photograph there, held down by a smooth river stone. A Japanese officer in full dress uniform, standing stiffly at attention. He was young, probably not much older than David, with sharp features and intense eyes. David almost put the sword back. Almost, but the officer was gone, probably dead in the evacuation or killed in one of the naval battles. The sword was just a thing now, an object. It didn't matter anymore. He climbed out of the bunker and headed back to camp. The change started that night. David's tent was hot and humid as always, the canvas walls offering little protection from the oppressive tropical heat. He'd stashed the sword under his cot, wrapped in a spare poncho. Nobody had noticed. Nobody asked questions. He fell asleep around 2200 hours, exhausted from the day's work. He dreamed of home, clean sheets, his mother's cooking, the cool Maine air. Good dreams, safe dreams. He woke at 03:00 to the sound of water dripping. Drip, drip, drip. David opened his eyes, disoriented. The tent was freezing, actually freezing. He could see his breath misting in the air, could feel goosebumps rising on his arms. That wasn't possible. It never got cold on Guadalcanal. Never. He fumbled for his flashlight, clicked it on. The beam revealed the source of the dripping. Water was pooling on the ground beside his cot. Not rain. The tent wasn't leaking. This water was coming from nowhere, just appearing on the canvas floor in a slow, steady puddle. David sat up, pulling his blanket around his shoulders. That is when he saw the footprints. Wet footprints, leading from the puddle to his cot. They were small, smaller than his own feet. The tread pattern was distinctive. Japanese jungle boots, the split. Toe design unmistakable. Someone had walked through the water. Someone had approached his cot while he slept. David swept the flashlight around the tent. Empty. He was alone. The other medics in his unit were in different tents. Nobody had any reason to be here. His eyes fell on the poncho, wrapped sword under the cot. In the flashlight beam, he could swear it was glowing. Just faintly, a phosphorescent shimmer, like bioluminescence. He reached for it, then stopped. His hand was shaking. Why was his hand shaking? He'd handled weapons 100 times. But something about the sword made his skin crawl, made every instinct scream at him to get away from it. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees. David's teeth began to chatter. The water puddle was spreading, soaking into his clothes, his blanket. He grabbed his boots and fled the tent. Standing outside in the warm night air, breathing hard. Just stress, he told himself. Fatigue. Too many bodies, too much death. His mind was playing tricks on him, but when he went back into the tent in the morning, the puddle was still there, and the footprints, dried now but visible, Real. The second night was worse. David tried to stay awake, sitting up with a book and a cup of coffee, but exhaustion won. He dozed off around midnight. The book falling from his hands, he woke, or thought he woke, to find himself paralyzed. Sleep paralysis. He'd experienced it before, knew what it was. Your mind wakes up before your body does, leaving you conscious but unable to move. It would pass, just had to breathe through it. But this time he wasn't alone. There was someone in the tent, standing at the foot of his cot. David could see him with perfect clarity despite the darkness. A Japanese officer in full uniform, the same man from the photograph, young, intense eyes, immaculately groomed, not a hair out of place, not a wrinkle in his uniform. The officer stood perfectly still, hands clasped behind his back, staring down at the sword. His expression was unreadable, not angry, not sad, just waiting. David tried to scream. His mouth wouldn't open. He tried to move. His body wouldn't respond. He was trapped in his own flesh, forced to watch as the officer slowly, deliberately reached down toward the sword. The officer's hand passed through the poncho, through the cot frame, insubstantial as smoke. But when his fingers touched the sword's scabbard, they became solid, real. He lifted it, held it reverently, studying it in the darkness. Then he looked at David, made eye contact, and David saw the truth in those eyes. This wasn't a ghost. This was something else, something that had been tied to the sword for so long it had become inseparable from it. The officer's soul hadn't moved on because it couldn't. It was bound to the blade, trapped in the steel and silk and lacquer. The officer replaced the sword carefully under the cot. Then he turned and walked out of the tent, footsteps leaving wet prints on the canvas floor. David's body unlocked. He gasped, rolling out of bed, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst. He grabbed the sword, started to throw it out of the tent, then stopped. He couldn't just discard it. That felt wrong, disrespectful. The officer wasn't malevolent. He was just there, watching over his sword, waiting for something. David wrapped it back up, shoved it deeper under the cot, and spent the rest of the night outside, watching the stars and trying to convince himself he'd imagined the whole thing. By the third night, the haunt had turned violent. David woke to pressure on his chest, weight, like someone was sitting on him. He opened his eyes and saw the officer's face inches from his own, those intense eyes boring into him. The officer's hands were on David's throat. Not squeezing, not yet, but the threat was clear. Give it back. The words didn't come from the officer's mouth. They appeared directly in David's mind, cold and sharp as the blade itself. Give it back. It is mine. It has always been mine. Give it back. David tried to speak, to explain, to apologize. The hands tightened on his throat. The pressure increased. He couldn't breathe. Spots danced in his vision. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The weight vanished. David gasped, coughing, clutching his throat. When he looked down, there were marks, finger-shaped bruises, already darkening. The next day, David tried to get rid of the sword. He took it deep into the jungle, found a ravine, and threw it as hard as he could. The scabbard tumbled end over end, disappearing into the undergrowth. When he returned to his tent that evening, the sword was back under his cot, in the exact same position, as if it had never left. David broke. He went to the chaplain, babbling about ghosts and curses and haunted swords. The chaplain was kind but skeptical. He suggested David might be suffering from combat fatigue, recommended he talk to the battalion surgeon. That night, the scratches appeared. David woke to pain, sharp, burning lines across his chest. He tore open his shirt to find 4 parallel scratches, deep enough to draw blood, running from his collarbone to his sternum, like someone had raked their nails across his skin. The officer stood at the foot of the cot, more solid now than ever before. His eyes were no longer patient. They were angry, demanding. The sword cannot leave the island without me. "And I cannot leave without the sword. We are bound. Return what is mine." "Where?" David croaked. "Where do I return it?" "You are dead. Your bunker is empty," the officer pointed. "Not at the jungle, at the ocean. At Iron Bottom Sound. My men are there. I should have been with them. Return me to them." David understood then. The officer had survived the campaign, had evacuated with the others, but his ship had been sunk during the withdrawal. He'd gone down with his men into those dark, cold waters, and his soul, bound to the sword left behind in the bunker, couldn't rest until the two were reunited. The next night, a rare night off from duty, David took the sword to the beach. A storm was rolling in, lightning flickering on the horizon, the ocean churning with whitecaps. The wind howled, palm trees bending nearly horizontal. He waded out until the water was waist, deep, fighting the waves. Rain lashed his face, thunder cracked overhead. He held the sword above his head, one hand on the scabbard, one on the hilt. "I am sorry," he shouted over the storm. "I am sorry I took it. Go to your men, rest." He threw it, put everything he had into it. The sword tumbled through the rain, caught a gust of wind, and disappeared into the churning waters of Iron Bottom Sound. For a moment, nothing happened. Then David saw him, the officer standing on the water, solid and real for the first time. The officer looked at David, and for the first time his expression changed. He smiled, not a happy smile, a relieved one. "Thank you." The officer turned and walked into the storm, into the sound, fading with each step until he was gone. The water where he'd walked began to glow, that same sickly green bioluminescence David had heard about in sailors' stories. But this time, it didn't feel malevolent. It felt peaceful, final. The glow faded. The storm began to ease. David trudged back to shore, exhausted but unburdened. He never saw the officer again. The cold spots disappeared. The wet footprints stopped. The sword never reappeared. It was over. David survived the war, went home, became a doctor, lived a long, quiet life. But he never kept souvenirs, never took mementos from his time in service. He'd learned his lesson. On Guadalcanal, you own nothing. The island owns everything. The dead own everything. And if you try to take what isn't yours, they will come for it. Always 6 months. That is how long the battle for Guadalcanal lasted. 6 months of hell compressed into 190 square miles of jungle and blood. When it ended, over 7,000 Americans and 30,000 Japanese had died. Ships lay shattered on the ocean floor. The jungle was scarred with craters and graves. Strategically, it was a turning point. The first major Allied offensive victory. The beginning of the island. Hopping campaign that would eventually take them to Tokyo Bay. Historians call it the Guadalcanal campaign. Military scholars study it. Veterans remember it. But the island remembers too, in its own way. Today, if you visit Guadalcanal, you can still find the traces. Rusted tanks in the jungle, unexploded ordnance, the hulls of ships visible beneath the clear water of Iron Bottom Sound, and sometimes, on quiet nights when the air is still and the moon is dark, you can hear things. The echo of Banzai charges on Bloody Ridge, the creak of phantom ships passing through the sound, the clicking of hungry ghosts in the jungle, the footsteps of men who never made it home because violence, when concentrated enough, scars more than flesh and earth. It scars reality itself. It creates wounds in the fabric of the world that never fully heal. Guadalcanal is one of those wounds, a place where the veil is thin, where the past bleeds into the present, where the dead don't always stay buried. But let's be clear about something. These stories aren't meant to diminish what happened there. The men who fought on Guadalcanal, American, Japanese, Australian, and all the others, showed incredible courage. They fought in conditions that would break most people. They endured heat, disease, starvation, and constant fear. They watched their friends die. They killed other human beings. They did terrible, necessary things in service of their nations. And they deserve to be remembered not as ghosts, but as the brave souls they were. Every name on every monument, every ship on the ocean floor, every grave, marked and unmarked, they all represent someone who had a life, had dreams, had people who loved them. So tonight, if you heard the whispers from Bloody Ridge, if you felt the chill of Iron Bottom sound, if you sensed the hunger in the jungle or the weight of the pale passenger, take a moment not to be afraid, but to remember. Remember what war costs. Remember what people sacrificed. Remember that every ghost story started with a real person who deserved better than to die in the mud or drown in the dark or starve in a forgotten cave. If you felt something tonight, if these stories reached you, hit that like button, not to ward off spirits, but to honor their memory. Subscribe to Ghost Stories of the Battles and ring the bell, because the Tokyo Express runs every night, and each shipment brings new stories of courage and sacrifice that deserve to be told. Tell me in the comments, do you believe the violence of war can scar the land itself? Or are these just the hallucinations of exhausted men pushed beyond their limits? Either way, the question is worth asking, because understanding how war haunts us, literally or metaphorically, might be the first step toward preventing the next one. Until next time, wherever the battles take us, keep your head down.